Hello, I'm Ollie and this is Criminolly, where I talk about crime, pulp, horror, that kind of thing. Today I want to have a chat about detectives and why we love them. So I feel like I've been neglecting crime fiction on the channel a bit recently. I seem to have gone through a bit of a phase of reading a lot more horror. Most of my kind of reviews and other videos have been about horror recently. So I thought it would be interesting to do a very much a crime focused video. So this one is about detectives. And I was thinking about detective fiction and what it is that appeals to me about it. And I was also thinking about the history of detective fiction. So one of the things I'm really interested in talking about on the channel is popular fiction generally, and how it fits into our culture and our society. And it occurred to me that unlike a lot of forms of popular fiction, so unlike horror or science fiction or westerns, detective fiction has been consistently popular for a long time. So if you think of the first kind of detective stories, so the Murders in the Rue Morgue by Edgar Allan Poe is often considered to be, the first modern detective story, or The Moonstone by Wilkie Collins is often named as the first detective novel. So The Moonstone came out in 1868, and the Poe story came out in 1841. So that's a long time ago, 160 years ago in the case of the Murders in the Rue Morgue. Sherlock Holmes, the first Sherlock Holmes story, and I've been starting to read through the Holmes stories recently. So A Study in Scarlet, the first Holmes story, came out in 1887. And if you think about it, I don't think there's been a period, certainly since the beginning of the 20th century, when there hasn't been a big amount of popular detective fiction published. Certainly, in my lifetime as a reader, detective fiction has always been popular. So crime fiction generally, but detective fiction in particular, has always been really popular. And as I say, unlike things like, so horror, had a boom in the 80s and is having a bit of a resurgence now, but definitely waned in, kind of the early 2000s. And Western, at one point, Westerns were absolutely massive. And now it's, Westerns are rarely published at all for various reasons. Some of them to do with, the politics of Westerns and cultural shifts and things like that. But yeah, crime fiction and detective fiction in particular seems to have been, consistently popular for over 100 years. And so I was thinking about, what is it that appeals to me about crime fiction, about detective fiction, and what is it that I think has a broad cultural appeal for everybody. Why has it become such an important part of popular culture? And not just, so not just fiction, but, movies and TV shows as well. TV, if you think of the vast number of TV detective shows, and again, since the heyday of TV, detective-based shows have been incredibly popular and continue to be so. And I think there are kind of three or four, and I can't decide if it's three or four because there's a bit of overlap between them. I think there's three or four things that make detective fiction particularly appealing to us as readers. So the first one is the fact that that detective fiction examines crime. It examines the darker things in our society that we might not want to think about sometimes, but equally that we know exist and that we know it's important that we understand to an extent. So I think crime fiction and detective fiction give us a way to understand crime, to understand murder, all sorts of horrible crimes in a safe way. So we can read about them and we can do it safe in the knowledge that we are just reading about fictional characters. It's not something that's really happened. And we can use that distance to help us process it, so that when we do see terrible things on the news that have happened, we have some kind of a defense mechanism almost, because we can feel like we kind of understand it. I think there's also something with detective fiction about bereavement. So if you think about detective stories or murder mysteries, as they're often called, they often start with the discovery of a dead body. And often, or not all the time, but generally, the stories will revolve around the detective trying to identify what has happened to somebody who's been murdered. Now, all of us inevitably at some point in our lives will go through the loss of a loved one. We will be bereaved. And I think, again, detective fiction gives us a safe way to experience the death of someone. And if you think about detective fiction, often a lot of the story will be the detective talking to people who knew the person who's died. So their friends, their family, husbands, wives, and so on, and trying to understand more about their life. And it almost becomes a bit like a eulogy to that dead character. So I think it's, again, a safe way for us to experience something that's very painful, and to do that from a distance. It becomes, that the death of that character becomes completely central to the book, in the same way that when you lose someone you love, for a period afterwards, while you go through the grieving process, that is the centre of your world. That loss is all you can think about. And I think in a way, detective fiction kind of mimics that grieving process. And then linked to that, to both the examination of the darkness and the the kind of study of bereavement, is this central question, or the central purpose of a mystery novel, which is to figure out why this terrible thing has happened. And again, I think it's something almost comforting for us to feel like when a terrible thing happens, when we read about something awful in the news, or we lose a loved one, that there's an explanation for it. It's not just a random terrible thing. And I think, for me personally, I find those, the idea of a random act of violence to be the most terrifying thing, because it could happen at any point. And I think, as I say, detective fiction gives us a bit of a comfort blanket by saying there is always a reason. There is always a reason why this bad thing has happened. And it may be a horrible, it may well be a horrible reason, but there is a reason. And not only that, at the end of the book, not 100% of the time, but generally speaking, at the end of a detective book, everything gets wrapped up. And, the world goes back to normal again. So again, going back to that grieving process, eventually you finish grieving and you process that loss, and the world does go back to normal. It's a different world, but it goes back to normal again. So yeah, I think that understanding of the why is really, really important in terms of the appeal of crime fiction and detective fiction. And then again, kind of related to that, and this is why I'm really hazy about whether this is 3 or 4 things. Related to that is the fact that we naturally enjoy puzzles. If you think about the popularity of, things like Candy Crush, or crosswords or Sudoku puzzles or whatever, people really, really enjoy doing puzzles. They enjoy having something put in front of them that needs to be solved. And part of the joy of reading a detective novel is seeing if you can figure out who done it yourself. Often, I have to say, in fact, generally, I can't. I'm terrible at figuring out who done it in detective novels. But I really enjoy the process of the detective explaining to me at the end of the book how they've figured it out. That kind of, that progression of their logic, I think, is really interesting. So I think that kind of puzzle element is a lighter part of the appeal of detective fiction than some of the other stuff I've talked about, but a really important one as well. And then the final thing is something that I think is a bit more of a modern thing, although maybe not that modern, because certainly I can think of examples from kind of the 50s that talk about this, and even earlier actually, and that's the conflict between our personal lives and our work lives. And this is something that detective fiction seems to talk about again and again and again. So you get the kind of tropes of either the detective who is just completely focused on solving mysteries. So someone like Sherlock Holmes, for example, when he's not solving mysteries, he's taking drugs because he gets so bored. But he has really no kind of personal life. Or a character like Inspector Morse in the Morse novels is similar. His personal life is a tiny part of the books, and the books are really about him being detective. He's a single man. He drinks too much because he's a single man, and he solves crimes. So that's one of the tropes, that kind of lonely detective. And then the other one is the detective who does have a family life, who does have a family around him or her, and who constantly battles to balance the pressures of work, of solving the murders, with their family life. And I think that's something that we all, any of us who work and have families, and even if we don't have families, that's something we all struggle with. There's always that time when you've got a deadline at work or something like that, where you have to work late or something, and you have to make that decision about, do you carry on working or do you stop and go home to your family? And it's something we see again and again in detective fiction, as I say, and I think that is a way for us to kind of reflect on that in our own lives and think about it in a way that doesn't feel too personal, because we're experiencing it through a character, rather than having to actually think about our own actions. So yeah, that's one that occurred to me as another thing that's a real appeal of detective fiction. And whilst it's not necessarily detective fiction as such, although it does involve solving of mysteries and crimes, I think the TV show 24 was that's basically what 24 was about. It wasn't about terrorism. It was about one man trying to balance his home life with his need to stop cities getting blown up and stuff like that. So I think it's a really important thing, and I think increasingly, particularly with things like home working nowadays, it's not like it was decades ago when a 9-to-5 job was a 9-to-5 job. You would work 9 to 5 in the office and then you would go home. Nowadays, I think there's much more of a kind of bleed through from our work lives into our personal lives. And so maybe that, that appeal of seeing other characters struggle with it and how they manage to justify it to themselves is something that has an appeal to all of us. So, time for a random book from the shelves from my favourite book series of all time, and therefore my favourite detective series of all time, Sadie When She Died by Ed McBain. So this is, I think, probably my favourite book in the series. I think this is a really fantastic book, and it's about a woman who has died and the detective trying to understand what's happened by talking to the men in her life, basically. And it ends up being incredibly dark. But it definitely plays into that kind of bereavement and dark places kind of thing that I was talking about at the start of the video. Also features Steve Carella. So Steve Carella is like the main character in the 87th Precinct series, and a character who very much has that struggle between home life and work life, albeit he has an incredibly understanding wife, Teddy, who seems to put up with a lot. But quite often in these books, his work life does kind of work its way into his home life in terms of threats to his family and things like that. So hopefully not something any of us face with our work lives. So yeah, if you've not read the 87th Precinct series, I always say this: if you like mysteries and you've not read the 87th Precinct series, do yourself a favour and read them. So I hope you found that interesting. As usual with these Sunday videos, that's kind of the start of the discussion, and I'd like to continue that discussion with all of you in the comments. So let me know why you think detective fiction is so popular. Let me know if you enjoy it. Let me know who your favourite detectives are. And as always, thank you very much for watching. Hope you're safe and well out there. Hope you're reading good stuff, and I'll speak to you again very soon. Cheerio.